If you've spent years studying military history, you already know that survival in World War II often came down to small, unglamorous decisions. Not heroic charges or legendary weapons, but where you slept, how you stayed dry, and whether you woke up functional the next morning. Soldiers didn't have the luxury of modern ultralight tents or Gore-Tex shelters. What they had instead was a brutally efficient shelter method so reliable that armies quietly relied on it across Europe and the Pacific. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't comfortable by modern standards, but it outlasted storms that shredded tents and kept men alive in conditions that killed the unprepared. What makes this shelter worth studying today isn't nostalgia. It's the fact that it solves the same problems that still defeat modern campers and survivalists: wind exposure, water runoff, heat retention, concealment and repairability under stress. Once you understand why this shelter worked so well in wartime, you start to see why many seasoned outdoorsmen still favour variations of it today, whether they realise it or not. Now let's get into the real substance. The shelter in question is the World War II ground-dug lean-to and earth shelter hybrid, often referred to in period manuals as a field bivouac or slit trench shelter with overhead cover. It was not a tent replacement in theory. It became one in practice because tents failed under sustained rain, shell shock vibrations and high winds. Canvas rotted, poles snapped, and exposed men froze. Earth, by contrast, stayed where it was put. The basic principle was simple. Instead of fighting the environment, soldiers used it. Infantrymen dug shallow trenches or depressions just deep enough to lower their profile below ground level. Soil acted as insulation, windbreak and ballistic protection. Over this depression, they constructed a low-profile roof using whatever was available. Ponchos, shelter halves, tarred canvas, branches, or even captured enemy material. The key was that the roof was angled sharply and anchored into the earth, allowing rain to run off instead of pooling. What made this shelter outperform tents during storms was physics, not luck. Wind loses strength the closer it gets to the ground. By sleeping below ground level, soldiers removed themselves from the worst gusts entirely. Rain, instead of battering vertical canvas walls, flowed over a sloped surface and drained away. Even sustained downpours became manageable as long as a shallow drainage channel was carved around the shelter perimeter. Heat retention was another overlooked advantage. Earth holds temperature far better than air. In cold environments like the Ardennes or Eastern Front, soldiers discovered that a shallow, dug-in shelter retained body heat dramatically better than any freestanding tent. Men would line the ground with pine boughs, straw, or even folded uniforms to prevent conductive heat loss. With two bodies sharing a shelter, temperatures inside could remain survivable even during freezing nights. Camouflage and concealment were equally critical. A tent announces itself. A low earth shelter disappears. Soldiers brushed the roof with sod, leaves or snow, blending it into the terrain. From the air or a distance, it was nearly invisible. This mattered not only tactically, but psychologically. Sleeping unseen reduced stress and improved rest, something wartime diaries mention far more often than official reports. Applying this knowledge today doesn't require reenactment-level authenticity. The principles translate directly. If you're caught in a storm without a tent, the first priority is terrain selection. Choose a slight rise, never a low point, and dig just enough to lower your body out of the wind. Even 6 to 12 inches makes a measurable difference. Use your tarp or poncho as a roof, not walls, and anchor it with soil, rocks or logs rather than stakes that can pull loose. Drainage is non-negotiable. WWII manuals emphasize shallow trenches for a reason. One hand-width channel around the shelter can mean the difference between dry sleep and hypothermia. This is not theory. Soldiers learned it the hard way during prolonged rains in Italy and Normandy. Modern survivalists who skip this step usually regret it before dawn. In wooded environments, fallen branches placed diagonally over the roof create structural strength, just as soldiers did when shelter halves were unavailable. In open terrain, even snow or sand can serve as roofing mass when layered over fabric. The goal is always the same: low profile, angled surfaces, and mass over exposure. One of the most valuable lessons from the Second World War shelter doctrine is, repairability. A torn tent is often just done for, you know? But an earth shelter, now that can be fixed with just a few minutes of work, even in total darkness. So, collapse becomes an inconvenience, not a catastrophe. That mindset alone is really worth adopting. This shelter, honestly, wasn't romantic, and it definitely wasn't comfortable, but it was dependable. That's exactly why it endured across so many theatres and armies, each with wildly different equipment. It worked because it respected environmental realities, instead of trying to override them with fabric and poles. If you're serious about understanding how soldiers actually survived the war, not just how they fought it, this shelter truly deserves your attention. It represents a convergence of military necessity, environmental awareness, and human endurance that, frankly, modern gear often obscures. If you found this breakdown valuable, do subscribe to Iron Age Instincts for more deep dives into forgotten military knowledge that still matters today. And share this with fellow history buffs and survival-minded thinkers who care about substance over spectacle.